The wind shears across the rocky slopes of Eilean Mòr with a violence that seems to challenge the very geometry of the earth, a constant, shrieking howl that tears across the North Atlantic and lashes at the stone walls of Scotland's most isolated lighthouse. In late December of 1900, when the supply steamer Hesperus finally managed to dock in the treacherous waters of the Flannan Isles after weeks of severe delays caused by relentless storms, the crew expected to find the usual routine of three weary men standing firm at their coastal surveillance post. Instead, what met them was an absolute, unnatural silence. There was no smoke rising from the chimney. There was no lookout signaling from the steep coastline. The national flag hung limp and forgotten from its mast. There was only the gray immensity of the ocean and an oppressive, palpable sense that time itself had abruptly halted in this forgotten corner of the world. When the captain and his men forced their way into the heavy iron door of the tower, the scene inside defied all logic and planted an immediate seed of dread. The main door was bolted from the inside, yet upon crossing the threshold, the residual warmth of the iron stoves and the silent, stationary wall clocks revealed that the evacuation, or the sudden disappearance, had occurred merely hours or perhaps days before. On the kitchen table, plates holding half-eaten cold meals awaited a return that never materialized. The heavy waterproof oilskins of all three lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were neatly hanging in their designated hooks, meaning at least one of them had stepped out into the raging, lethal winter gale entirely unprotected against the freezing Scottish cold. For a garrison strictly trained under the unyielding standards of the Northern Lighthouse Service, abandoning a post voluntarily was an unthinkable offense, an absolute collapse of both civil and military discipline. Yet, as the investigators began scouring the logbooks and official registers left behind, it became overwhelmingly apparent that the true horror was not merely the sudden disappearance of the men, but what they had meticulously documented in the weeks leading up to that final deafening silence. The open pages did not merely describe routine winter tempests, but rather an escalating atmosphere of psychological terror, marked by winds of monstrous, unnatural force that seemed to wail with human voices, and an isolation so profound it steadily began to corrode the sanity of experienced, hardened minds. This was no ordinary maritime mishap along the patrolled shipping lanes of the turn-of-the-century naval buildup. It was the chilling inception of an insurmountable enigma that forced officers to question whether the human mind is truly capable of enduring the absolute weight of the void when war, solitude, and the raw elements converge upon a single point. And to fully comprehend the true magnitude of what transpired upon those dark, churning cliffs, we must turn our gaze directly toward the handwritten entries left behind by the men who vanished into the freezing mist. To understand the creeping dread that ultimately consumed the minds of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, one must look directly at the physical evidence left rotting in the station's logbooks, pages filled with hurried, erratic handwriting that starkly contrasted with the meticulous, ironclad discipline expected of professional lighthouse keepers. For weeks prior to the fateful arrival of the relief ship, the daily entries had ceased to be mere logistical reports of oil consumption, weather shifts, and passing merchant vessels. Instead, they transformed into a harrowing chronicle of psychological erosion, recording strange meteorological phenomena that defied rational explanation and acoustic anomalies that seemed to target the very sanity of the men stationed on the edge of the world. Thomas Marshall, known among his peers for his steady nerves and unyielding temperament, was the principal hand behind the most unsettling passages. In entries dated mid-December, he described a relentless, howling gale that carried an entirely distinct acoustic texture, not merely the typical whistling of wind through granite crevices, but sounds resembling human cries, urgent shouting carried over the breaking surf, and a persistent, rhythmic pounding on the heavy oak doors of the compound when no living soul could possibly be standing outside in the freezing deluge. The entries became increasingly fragmented, reflecting men who were sleeping poorly, jumping at shadows cast by their own paraffin lamps, and staring endlessly out into the fog-shrouded horizon as if anticipating an imminent, unseen arrival from the depths of the gray Atlantic. We must pause for a moment to consider the profound psychological toll of total isolation during an era when the world was already bracing for unprecedented geopolitical shifts and sweeping modern conflicts. The lighthouse was not merely a structural refuge, it was a psychological pressure cooker. When experienced mariners find themselves stripped of all human contact, reduced to the ticking of mechanical clocks, the sputtering of oil flames, and the deafening roar of an indifferent ocean, the boundary between external reality and internal anxiety begins to dissolve completely. The logbook pages reveal a growing paranoia, a shared psychosis born from weeks of sensory deprivation punctuated only by violent storms that cut them off from any possibility of rescue or relief. Yet, what makes the physical logbook discovery truly terrifying is not just the emotional instability documented within its lines, but the abrupt manner in which the handwriting changes and then stops altogether. The final entry, scrawled hastily just days before the Hesperus dropped anchor, spoke of a storm of unprecedented fury, a monstrous gale that struck with such sudden, cataclysmic violence that it seemingly tore the emotional stability of the keepers away alongside physical structures on the island. They were men under siege by nature itself, yet nothing in their training had prepared them for an enemy that whispered from the wind and left no footprints in the mud, setting the stage for the inexplicable physical clues that would baffle investigators for generations to come. When the rescue party finally breached the heavy iron gates of the lighthouse enclosure, the physical configuration of the station presented a series of contradictory anomalies that completely defied all standard maritime protocols. The landing platform below, exposed to the fury of the open Atlantic, featured a massive wrought iron crane used for hauling heavy crates of fuel oil and provisions from supply boats up the vertical cliffs. Secured to this iron crane was a heavy mooring rope, coiled with intentional precision, yet somehow missing its anchor point, as if it had been forcefully unfastened or torn away during a moment of extreme panic. The wooden crates and supply boxes stacked near the crane remained completely untouched by the storm, proving conclusively that the men had not descended the steep cliffside stairway to secure loose equipment while the tempest raged around them. Yet, as the investigators climbed the steep stone steps leading from the landing platform toward the main tower, they discovered a landscape of inexplicable devastation. The western landing stage, perched high above the crashing waves, showed signs of structural damage so severe that seasoned engineers shook their heads in utter disbelief. Heavy iron railings had been twisted and bent outward as though struck by a colossal kinetic force. Massive blocks of solid greenstone weighing upwards of a ton had been dislodged from their mortar beds and tossed inland, and a storage crate securely bolted to the rock face had been completely ripped from its fasteners. It was physical evidence suggesting that a wave of unimaginable, freak proportions had crashed against the cliff face, reaching heights that defied every historical record of the North Atlantic weather patterns. Yet, this physical destruction at sea level contrasted sharply with the pristine, untouched interior of the living quarters just a few dozen yards away. If a tidal wave of such monumental proportions had swept over the island with enough force to tear iron rails from the stone, why were the windows of the lighthouse entirely intact? Why were the small outbuildings spared from structural collapse? The contradiction tore through the logic of the investigators, forcing them to weigh two equally terrifying possibilities. Either the men had been swept away simultaneously while attempting a perilous repair during an unprecedented rogue wave, or something far more elusive, psychological, and terrifying had fractured their judgment at the very edge of the world. As the search party moved through the silent rooms, examining every corner for a hidden clue or a discarded fragment of writing, the oppressive weight of the island's isolation seemed to press down upon them as well. Every ticking clock had long since run out of power. Every shadow cast by the flickering lanterns felt heavy with unspoken secrets. The physical architecture of the station stood like a silent witness to an event that refused to be categorized as a simple maritime disaster, leaving the investigators standing at the threshold of a psychological labyrinth from which there appeared to be no rational escape. With the physical anomalies of the exterior examined and documented, investigators turned their full attention to the interior of the living quarters, where the true, haunting nature of the mystery began to take shape. Every single personal possession belonging to James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur remained inside the tower, untouched by the elements. Their pipes, tobacco pouches, spare boots, and personal letters were exactly where one would expect to find them in a home temporarily vacated. Yet, the absence of human presence created a psychological vacuum that felt almost suffocating. There were no bodies, no notes of farewell, no signs of a struggle within the stone walls, and no structural damage to suggest an internal catastrophe. The three experienced keepers had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind a locked fortress at the edge of the abyss. To grasp the sheer impossibility of this disappearance, one must understand the rigorous protocols governing lighthouse operations during the turn of the century. Regulations strictly dictated that at least 2 keepers must remain inside the tower at all times to maintain the lamp and monitor the machinery, while a third could perform outdoor inspections or domestic duties only under favorable conditions. Yet, the logbook and the physical arrangement of their outdoor garments suggested a catastrophic breakdown of these unyielding rules. Thomas Marshall's waterproof oilskins were left behind, alongside his boots, meaning he had stepped out into the freezing, lethal spray of a hurricane-force gale, wearing only indoor clothing, an act of sheer madness or desperate urgency that defied every instinct of a seasoned mariner. As investigators cross-referenced the timeline of the relief ship's arrival with the meteorological data of the surrounding North Atlantic, an even darker picture emerged regarding the sheer isolation these men endured. For months, wartime tensions and maritime restrictions had severely delayed supply routes, leaving remote coastal outposts starved of fresh provisions and cut off from any reliable communication with the mainland. The psychological strain of watching the horizon day after day, waiting for a steamer that failed to appear while gale-force winds battered the stone foundations of their refuge, created a pressure cooker environment. Men trapped in such conditions often experienced sensory distortions, where the constant, deafening roar of the ocean began to mimic human voices, whispers, and urgent calls for help echoing from the churning surf below. This brings us to the most agonizing question that haunted the inquiry boards for decades. What compelled three rational, disciplined men to abandon their secure posts simultaneously in the dead of winter, stepping out into a raging storm without proper protective gear? Was it a collective psychological fracture brought on by months of unbroken silence, or had something truly inexplicable materialized on the rocky shores of Eilean Mòr, drawing them outward into the freezing dark? As we probe deeper into the lingering silence of that desolate island, the boundary between physical tragedy and psychological descent blurs entirely, leaving behind an enduring enigma that no official report could ever fully resolve. As the official inquiry boards convened in Edinburgh to unravel the chilling enigma of Eilean Mòr, the collective weight of the evidence, or the frustrating lack thereof, began to press heavily upon maritime authorities and government officials alike. The inquiry was spearheaded by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Service, a man renowned for his unyielding pragmatism and decades of experience navigating the treacherous coasts of Scotland. Yet, as Muirhead stepped onto the desolate island and surveyed the silent rooms, the iron-plated door, and the empty logbooks, even his seasoned judgment wavered. Every logical deduction collided with an impossible physical contradiction. How could three seasoned veterans vanish from a locked fortress without leaving a single footprint, a single body, or a single clue pointing toward their final destination? The official report ultimately leaned toward a tragic hypothesis of nature's raw, untamed fury, suggesting that a sudden, monstrous rogue wave had swept the men away while they were hastily attempting to secure equipment near the lower landing platform during an unprecedented gale. Yet, this tidy bureaucratic conclusion left more questions than it answered, failing to account for why two of the men had ventured out without their waterproof oilskins in freezing temperatures, or why the logbook entries preceding their disappearance documented a growing, palpable terror that had nothing to do with standard weather patterns. The families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur rejected the official narrative, sensing that the cold language of government reports was merely attempting to bury a much darker, more inexplicable truth that the authorities simply chose not to confront. We must pause to examine why this particular mystery continues to haunt the collective consciousness of historians and mariners more than a century later. It is not merely because three men vanished into thin air, but because their disappearance laid bare the absolute insignificance of humanity when pitted against the indifferent, crushing weight of the elements and the profound psychological abyss of total isolation. The lighthouse was designed to be a beacon of safety, a guiding light cutting through the darkest nights to protect passing ships from destruction. Yet, on that fateful December, the beacon became a tomb of silence, proving that the most terrifying darkness is not found in the depths of the ocean, but within the unmapped corners of human endurance when the world forgets you exist. The inquiry was formally closed, filed away in dusty government archives under an unyielding stamp of unresolved mystery, but the ghosts of Eilean Mòr refused to be silenced by bureaucratic paperwork. Sailors passing the Flannan Isles for decades afterward reported an unnatural chill lingering around the rocky cliffs, a persistent feeling of being watched by invisible eyes standing upon the upper gallery. And as the modern era of automated lighthouses rendered human keepers obsolete, the tragic fate of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur remained the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when man pushes too far into the desolate margins of the world, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions that continue to echo across the dark, churning waters of the North Atlantic. As the decades continue to dissolve into the relentless march of time, the mystery of Eilean Mòr stands frozen in the collective memory of the maritime world, an unyielding monument to the fragile boundary between human sanity and the infinite, indifferent void. Governments change. Modern communication networks span the globe with absolute precision, and automated technologies replace the weathered stone lighthouses that once depended on human hands to keep their beacons burning. Yet no amount of modern engineering can erase the haunting void left behind by James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur on that bleak December evening in 1900. Their disappearance remains an insurmountable wall in the architecture of historical investigation, a stark reminder that certain secrets are not merely concealed by human hands, but swallowed whole by the elements, protected by the impenetrable silence of the North Atlantic. We are left to ponder the ultimate, chilling reality of what those men endured during their final weeks in the isolation of the Scottish cliffs. They were not broken by cowardice or lack of discipline. They were crushed by an adversary far more terrifying than any visible enemy on a battlefield. The relentless erosion of hope, the oppressive weight of total solitude, and the haunting realization that the world they served had quietly forgotten them at the edge of the map. When the logbook pages were closed for the final time, they did not just document a meteorological event. They recorded the silent, agonizing descent of human endurance when pushed past its absolute breaking point, leaving behind an empty fortress where the wind still howls with the voices of those who never returned. This is the true legacy of the Flannan Isles, a haunting testament to the forgotten souls who stood watch in the dark so that others might find their way home, only to be swallowed by the very darkness they were meant to defy. Their names are etched into the ledgers of maritime history, but their ultimate fate remains forever bound to the churning gray waves that crash against the jagged rocks of Eilean Mòr. And as long as ships continue to chart the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic, the ghost of that silent lighthouse will continue to cast its long, melancholic shadow across the pages of history, whispering a timeless warning about the terrifying depth of the unknown when man confronts the ultimate emptiness of the world.